I sat in the helicopter, watching the desert blur beneath us. The rhythmic thump of the rotors had become white noise hours ago, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Never a good place to be these days. Mark had found me 3 days ago in my apartment in Phoenix. I'd been surrounded by empty bottles and unpaid bills, mail piled up by the door where I'd kicked it aside for weeks. I barely recognized him at first through the fog of cheap whiskey. "Jesus, Dan," he'd said, stepping over a pizza box. "You look like shit." I hadn't bothered to answer. What was there to say? Yeah, I looked like shit. I felt like shit. I was shit. The proposition he laid out was simple. Explore an abandoned city built in the 70s somewhere in the Nevada desert, get paid enough to disappear forever. The kind of off-the-books job that made sense coming from Mark. We'd served together years ago, before he moved into the private sector, doing things neither of us talked about. I didn't care about the money. Sarah and Lily had been dead for 2 years, crushed in their Honda on I-10 by a drunk driver while I was deployed. The insurance money sat untouched in an account I never checked. What was the point of more? "You need to get out of this place," Mark had said, gesturing at my apartment with its drawn blinds and stale air. I'd agreed, not because I wanted to leave, but because staying required energy I no longer possessed. The helicopter began its descent, pulling me back to the present. Below us, a collection of tents and vehicles marked our staging area outside Tonopah. It looked like a military operation trying not to look like one. We touched down on a makeshift landing pad, dust swirling around us as the rotors slowed. Mark clapped my shoulder as we ducked under the blades. "Home sweet home for the next 12 hours, he said, pointing to the largest tent. "Let's get you introduced to the team." I followed him across the packed dirt, my duffel bag light on my shoulder. I'd packed in 10 minutes, some clothes, toiletries, the photo of Sarah and Lily I kept face down on my nightstand. Nothing else mattered. The tent was cooler inside, industrial fans pushing air around without really cutting the heat. A folding table dominated the center, covered with maps, satellite photos, and equipment. "This is Jin," Mark said, nodding toward a thin Korean man who kept checking satellite photos against what looked like hand-drawn maps. "Best guide in the business. He's been studying this place for months." Jin glanced up, his eyes evaluating me quickly before returning to his work. He had the intense focus of someone who lived in details. "And Alan," Mark continued, gesturing toward a man in the corner. Alan was built like a linebacker, broad-shouldered and solid. Burn scars covered his neck, disappearing beneath his collar. He sat cleaning a rifle with practiced, methodical movements, not bothering to look up at the introduction. "Daniel Mitchell," I said to nobody in particular. Jin nodded without looking up. Alan continued cleaning his rifle. "Not much for conversation, our Alan," Mark said quietly, "but he's been out there before. Some kind of security contractor." I dropped my bag near an empty cot. "What exactly are we looking for out there?" Mark spread his hands. "Officially, structural assessment. The place was some kind of planned community built by the military, then abandoned. They want to know if it can be repurposed." The lie was so obvious I didn't bother calling him on it. Government projects don't hire washed-up ex-soldiers and security contractors for structural assessments. "And unofficially?" I asked. "Unofficially, you get paid and ask minimal questions." Mark smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Rest up. We move out at noon." I spent the next few hours lying on my cot, staring at the tent ceiling, listening to Jin mutter measurements to himself and the rhythmic sound of Alan working on his rifle. I thought about calling my sister, telling her where I was going. But what would I say? That I'd taken a mysterious job in the desert because I couldn't bear to spend another day in my apartment with the ghosts. She'd given up on me months ago anyway. When noon approached, I joined the others outside. The sun had peaked, harsh and white in a cloudless sky. The heat pressed down like a physical weight. We loaded into 2 trucks, Mark and Jin in the lead vehicle, Alan and me in the second. Alan drove in silence, one hand on the wheel, the other resting near a holster on his hip. I watched the landscape through the window, wondering what kind of structural assessment required armed escorts. 2 hours of dirt roads led us deeper into nothing. Scrub brush and bare rock gave way to shallow valleys, then deeper ones carved between mountain ranges. The trucks kicked up dust clouds that hung in the still air behind us. "You military?" Alan asked suddenly, his voice rough from disuse. Was, I answered. 8 years. You? He nodded once. 11. Special Forces. That explained the scars, maybe. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. Men like us had learned that most words were unnecessary. We crested a rise and Alan slowed the truck. Ahead of us, Jin had stopped completely. The city appeared suddenly in the valley below us, massive concrete towers and sprawling complexes stretching for miles, shimmering slightly in the heat. It looked like someone had dropped a small metropolis in the middle of nowhere, then walked away. No roads led to it except the dirt track we were on. "Oh, what the hell?" I muttered. Alan didn't respond, his eyes fixed on Jin, who had stepped out of the lead truck. I got out too, the heat hitting me like a wall. Jin stood at the edge of the ridge, his body rigid, one arm extended toward the city. His hands shook as he pointed at a tower in the distance, taller than the others, rising from what looked like the city center. Mark was saying something to him, but Jin kept pointing, his mouth moving rapidly. Alan moved past me with surprising speed for his size. He grabbed Jin's shoulder and turned him away from the tower, leaning down to whisper something in the smaller man's ear. Whatever he said made Jin's face go pale. He stopped talking mid-sentence, his eyes widening as he stared at Alan. "Everything okay?" I called out, walking toward them. Mark waved me off. "Just a misunderstanding about the route. We're good." Jin climbed back into the lead truck without another word. Alan stood for a moment longer, staring at the city below us before returning to our vehicle. "What was that about?" I asked as he started the engine. Alan adjusted his mirror, his face expressionless. "Nothing you need to worry about yet." The way he said "yet" made something cold settle in my stomach, the first real feeling I'd had in months. As we descended toward the city, I found myself focusing on that sensation, holding onto it. Fear, unease, whatever it was. It felt almost good after so much emptiness. I looked at the tower Jin had pointed to. From this angle, it seemed to waver slightly, like a mirage. Probably just the heat, I told myself. But I noticed Alan was carefully not looking at it as we drove down into the valley, his eyes fixed on the truck ahead of us instead. We drove down the dirt track toward the city, the trucks bumping over uneven ground. The strange cold feeling in my stomach persisted as we approached the sprawling concrete structures. I kept my eyes fixed ahead, though I caught myself wanting to look at that tower Jin had pointed to. Something about it pulled at my vision, an urge I forced myself to resist after seeing Alan's reaction. The truck slowed as we reached what might have been city limits. No welcome sign, just a sudden transition from desert to pavement. Mark raised his fist out the window of the lead vehicle, signaling us to stop. "End of the road," Alan said, killing the engine. "We go on foot from here." I grabbed my pack from the back seat. "Why not drive in?" Alan shook his head. "Streets get too narrow. Plus, engines don't work right in there." Before I could ask what he meant, he was out of the truck, shouldering his rifle and pack with practiced efficiency. I followed him to where Mark and Jin stood conferring over a map. "We'll stick to the route," Mark was saying. Jin nodded, but his eyes kept darting toward the city center. His earlier panic seemed controlled now, but just barely. "Everyone check your gear," Mark said as we gathered around. "Radio's on channel 3. We maintain visual contact at all times." 20 minutes later, we crossed into the outer district of the city. The pavement under our boots was cracked but intact, with weeds pushing through in places. Buildings rose on either side, concrete structures with boarded windows and faded signs. Nothing unusual at first glance. Then I noticed the streets. They were wrong. Too narrow for cars despite the parking meters lining them. The pavement itself seemed to angle in ways that made my eyes hurt when I tried to follow them to their end. What should have been straight lines curved subtly, meeting other streets at impossible angles. "You feel it, don't you?" Alan asked quietly, walking beside me. I nodded, unsure what exactly I was agreeing to. "The layout doesn't make sense," he continued. "Your brain knows it, even if you can't put your finger on why." Ahead of us, Jin stopped abruptly, pointing toward the city center. "The tower. It's wrong." I looked up, finally allowing myself to focus on the structure that had caused his panic earlier. It took several seconds for my mind to process what I was seeing. The tower wasn't just tall. It seemed to be upside down, its widest point at the top, narrowing as it reached toward the ground. But it also wasn't upside down. It was simply wrong, as if the laws of perspective had been rewritten for this one building. "It's not really there," Alan said, his voice flat. "Or rather, it's above us somehow, inverted against physics." "That's not possible," Mark said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Nothing here is possible," Alan replied. "That's why we're here, isn't it?" Mark didn't answer, just gestured for us to continue. The air tasted metallic as we moved deeper into the city. I noticed Jin checking his compass, then frowning. He tapped it against his palm several times before showing it to Mark. The needle spun wildly, sometimes completing full rotations before snapping back in the opposite direction. "Radio check," Mark said into his handset. I keyed mine in response and heard only static, but within the white noise, something else. Whispers, barely audible, in no language I recognized. I caught fragments that sounded almost like words before they dissolved back into static. "Is anyone else hearing?" I started. "Yes," Alan cut me off. "Don't listen too hard." We moved through what Alan identified as the industrial sector. Warehouses loomed on either side, their loading bays still fitted with rusted metal doors. Mark tried one, heaving it upward with a grinding of long unused tracks. The opening revealed only a solid concrete wall where the interior of the warehouse should have been. "That's not," Mark began, then tried another door with the same result. "This whole place is like this," Alan said. "Doors that open to nowhere, windows looking into solid concrete. The longer you stay, the less sense it makes." We walked for what felt like hours, but my watch said was only 40 minutes. The streets seemed to loop back on themselves despite us maintaining a straight course. Twice we found ourselves back at the same intersection despite having never turned around. "There," Jin said, pointing ahead to what should have been a plaza or town square. In the center stood a statue, at least 30 feet tall. From a distance, it looked like a classical sculpture, a human figure with arm outstretched toward the sky. But as we approached, details emerged that made my skin crawl. It wasn't carved stone. The surface had a waxy sheen that caught the light wrong. Closer still, I could see patterns that resembled muscle tissue, fibrous structures layered like anatomical drawings. What I had taken for stone was organic, bone and tissue arranged in artistic patterns that mimicked the human form while being fundamentally wrong in every detail. Despite everything, it was beautiful. The composition showed mastery beyond anything I'd seen in modern sculpture. The fact that it was made from what looked like human material only made it more disturbing in its perfection. Mark doubled over and vomited onto the pavement. Jin started hyperventilating again, his breathing coming in short, panicked gasps as he backed away from the statue. "Who would build this?" I asked no one in particular. "Who could build this?" Movement caught my eye, a flicker in one of the windows of the buildings surrounding the plaza. I turned my head slowly, not wanting to draw attention, and saw them. Figures watching from windows that shouldn't exist, in buildings that we'd already established had no interior floors. They stood perfectly still, visible only as silhouettes against the darkness inside. "Alan," I said quietly. 2 o'clock, top floor." Alan followed my gaze, then wordlessly unslung his rifle. Instead of aiming it, he pulled a flare from his vest, loaded it into an underslung launcher, and fired. The burning red light arced through the air and crashed through one of the windows, illuminating the interior in a harsh crimson glow. Dozens of people stood motionless in physically impossible spaces. Some hung suspended between floors that didn't exist. Others stood on walls as if gravity worked sideways. Their bodies were twisted into angles that bones couldn't make. Limbs bent backward, necks rotated beyond natural limits, torsos coiled like springs. In the pulsing red light, they didn't move, didn't blink, just stared out at us with eyes that reflected the flare like animals caught in headlights. 3 hours into our exploration, Jin collapsed. One moment, he was walking ahead of us through what might have been a commercial district, storefronts with nameless signs, empty display windows that reflected nothing. And the next, his legs simply gave out. He hit the cracked pavement with a dull thud that made Mark and Alan freeze in their tracks. I reached him first, rolling him onto his back. His eyes were open but unfocused, darting rapidly beneath half-closed lids. I pressed 2 fingers against his neck, finding his pulse racing but steady. "Jin," I said, keeping my voice low. Can you hear me?" His lips moved wordlessly, skin clammy and pale. I unscrewed my canteen and tilted a small amount of water into his mouth. Most of it spilled down his chin, but he swallowed some, coughing weakly. "What's happening to him?" Mark asked, crouching beside me. "The city's getting to him," Alan answered from where he stood watch, rifle at the ready. "It happens faster to some people than others." I was about to ask what exactly it was when the sound of footsteps broke the silence. They came from an alleyway between two concrete buildings, an alley I was certain hadn't existed moments before. The opening was there now, a narrow gap that seemed to bend inward at an impossible angle. A figure emerged from the darkness. At first glance, it looked like a man in a suit, but as it stepped into the light, I could see everything was wrong. Its torso stretched too long, at least a foot beyond human proportions. Arms hung at its sides, bending not just at the elbows, but at 3 or 4 additional joints that rippled as it moved. Worst was its face, features sliding across skin like wax melting in the sun, mouth and eyes repositioning themselves with each step. "Jin-ah," it said in a soft feminine voice. "Eoman은 너무 좋아. 그것은 아프지 않습니다." Jin's entire body went rigid. He sat up so suddenly I nearly fell backward. "That's my mother's voice," he whispered, terror breaking through his daze. Those were her last words before she died. No one else knows those words. The thing smiled, its mouth stretching far too wide, teeth visible all the way to where ears should be. "Jin-ah," it repeated, taking another step forward. Jin screamed, a raw sound of pure terror that cut through the unnatural silence of the city. At the same moment, the thing lunged forward with impossible speed, covering the distance between us in less than a second. Alan fired 3 shots in rapid succession. The bullets hit the entity square in the chest, causing its body to jerk backward slightly. But instead of falling, it simply paused, looking down at the holes punched through its suit. No blood came out. The wounds sealed themselves as we watched, fabric and flesh knitting back together. "Move!" Alan shouted, firing again as Mark and I grabbed Jin under his arms. We half carried, half dragged him between us, running down the street as Alan provided covering fire. Jin's feet scraped along the ground, occasionally finding purchase enough to help us move faster. His eyes were wide open now, fixed on something behind us. "It's still coming," he gasped. "They're all coming." I risked a glance back. The first entity was indeed following, moving with a jerky gait that covered ground far faster than should be possible. Worse, more figures were emerging from doorways and side streets, each with the same wrong proportions, the same sliding features. We turned a corner onto what had been a main boulevard when we'd entered this district. Now it was a narrow residential street lined with small homes. The city was rearranging itself behind us, streets shifting and changing. Another turn brought us to a dead end that hadn't been there before, forcing us to double back. "This way!" Alan shouted, gesturing toward a glass-fronted building that looked like it might have been an office complex. As we ran, the entities began to speak. Each one called out in a different voice, voices that made my companions flinch as if struck. "Peterson," called one to Mark, "you left me in that ditch. You promised you'd come back." Mark stumbled, his face draining of color. "My spotter in Fallujah," he muttered. "He bled out waiting for extraction." Another spoke to Alan in a woman's tearful plea. "Baby, please, you said you'd protect us. Why did you leave us there?" Alan's expression didn't change, but his next shots went wide, missing the approaching figures entirely. Then I heard it. Sarah's voice, exactly as I remembered it, coming from somewhere in the crowd of twisted shapes. "Dan, help us! Lily's trapped! The car's on fire! I can't reach her!" My body went cold. I knew it was wrong. Sarah had died on impact. The police report had been clear. Neither of them had suffered in the wreck. There had been no fire. But the voice was perfect, the exact pitch and cadence of her panic, the way she'd always emphasized the first syllable of Lily's name. "It's not real," I said aloud, more to myself than the others. It doesn't matter," Alan replied, reloading his rifle as we reached the building. "It knows exactly what hurts you most." Mark smashed the glass door with the butt of his pistol, clearing shards from the frame before we pulled Jin through. Alan followed, backing in with his rifle raised. "The service desk," he ordered, pointing to a heavy reception counter. "We can use it as a barricade." Mark and I dragged it across the shattered entrance while Alan covered us. Outside, the entities had stopped advancing. They stood in a loose semicircle about 20 yards from the building, watching with faces that constantly shifted between different human expressions. We propped Jin against a wall. His eyes had rolled back, showing mostly whites, and he was mumbling a stream of numbers that made no sense. 37914, 9628, 37914. The sequence repeated, his voice flat and mechanical. "What's happening to him?" I asked, wetting my bandana with water from my canteen and pressing it to his forehead. "His mind is trying to create patterns to make sense of this place," Alan said, positioning himself at a window with a clear line of fire to the street. "When that fails, some people retreat into mathematics, sequences, counting, things with fixed rules. It won't help him." "You've seen this before," Mark said. It wasn't a question. Alan was silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving the entities outside. They hadn't moved, but they hadn't left either. "Yes," he finally answered. "Years ago, I was part of another team, security detail just like now." "What happened to them?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "Nobody else made it out," Alan said, his voice flat. "Not physically intact, anyway. Some of their bodies were recovered, but their minds—" He shook his head. "You knew what we were walking into," Mark accused, anger breaking through his usual control. "You knew what this place was." "So did you," Alan replied, finally turning to face us. "Or at least, your employers did. The military has been sending people into this city for decades. They study who survives and who doesn't. They want to understand what makes someone able to resist whatever this place does to your mind." "Why not tell us what to expect?" I asked. "Would you have believed me?" Alan gestured toward the street where the entities still waited. "Would you have believed any of this was possible?" Mark leaned against the wall, running a hand over his face. "How do we get out?" "We don't," Alan said simply. "Not all of us. Not if the pattern holds." Outside, the entities began to call our names again, each in the voice of someone we had lost. I covered my ears, but Sarah's voice cut through anyway, begging me to save our daughter from flames that had never existed. I woke to a harsh light cutting across my face. Something was wrong with it, too orange, too directional for the fluorescent lighting of the office building. I sat up slowly, my back stiff from sleeping against the wall. The others were already awake, gathered by a window. Mark stood with his arms crossed while Alan knelt on the floor beside something I couldn't quite see. "Is that sunlight?" I asked, my voice rough from sleep. Mark turned, his face tight with tension. "Come look at this." I pushed myself up and joined him at the window. Outside, the sun hung low in the sky, bathing everything in early morning light. But it was in the north. Not east where it should be rising, but directly north, impossible and wrong. The shadows it cast didn't fall correctly either. They stretched upward, defying gravity, clinging to the sides of buildings like dark stains trying to climb. "That's not possible," I said, though the words felt hollow after everything we'd seen. "Nothing here is," Mark replied, turning away from the window. I followed his gaze to where Alan knelt on the floor. He was holding Jin's hand, tears silently tracking down his weathered face. Jin was lying, motionless, his body twisted into a shape that no living human could maintain. His torso had rotated nearly 180 degrees, while his limbs bent at angles that would have shattered bone. His face was frozen in an expression of terrible understanding, eyes wide and mouth open in a silent scream. "When did he—" I couldn't finish the question. "Sometime during the night," Alan said without looking up. "I was on watch. He started convulsing around 3, according to my watch. Kept repeating those numbers faster and faster until they didn't sound like words anymore. Then he just changed." Alan gently laid Jin's hand down and stood up. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, composing himself with visible effort. "We need to move," he said. "We can't stay here." "We can't just leave him," Mark protested. "We have to," Alan said. "Look at the walls." I hadn't noticed it until he mentioned it, but now I couldn't unsee it. The walls of the office building were moving, expanding and contracting in a slow, rhythmic pattern like breathing. I placed my palm against the nearest surface and felt a pulse beneath it, perfectly synchronized with my own heartbeat. The building was alive, somehow connected to me. "Jesus," I whispered, pulling my hand away. It's getting worse," Alan said, gathering his pack. "The longer we stay, the more this place reshapes itself around us. Those things outside might be gone, but the city itself is just as dangerous. Mark hesitated, looking down at Jin's body. We should at least try to bury him. With what? Alan asked. Your hands? The floor is solid concrete, and even if we could, do you really think this place would let him rest? No. We leave now or we don't leave at all. Mark finally nodded, his jaw tight. I collected my pack, trying not to look at Jin again. There was nothing of him left in that twisted form anyway. We moved the barricade and stepped out into the wrong sunlight. The city had completely transformed overnight. Streets we'd traveled the day before had vanished, replaced by narrow corridors between buildings that hadn't existed. The office building itself now stood at the edge of what looked like a massive sinkhole, a depression in the earth that plunged downward at an impossible angle. This was a main street yesterday, Mark said, staring down into the pit. It's reshaping itself, Alan replied. The geometry shifts faster when we sleep. Which way is out? I asked. Mark pulled out his compass and flipped open the lid. The needle spun wildly before splitting into 5 separate needles, each pointing in a different direction. He snapped it shut with a curse. This way, Alan said, pointing down a narrow passage between 2 concrete structures. The edge should be about 2 miles in that direction, if the city hasn't expanded. You sound sure, I said. I'm not, he admitted, but it's better than standing still. We moved carefully through the transformed landscape. Some passages led underground, spiraling down concrete tunnels before suddenly emerging onto rooftops with no connecting stairs or elevators. Others doubled back on themselves despite appearing straight. Doors opened onto sheer drops or solid walls. Windows showed impossible scenes, oceans, mountains, cities that weren't this one. After what felt like hours of walking, we came to a particularly narrow passage. The walls on either side rose at least 50 feet, smooth concrete with no windows or features. The passage itself was barely wide enough for us to walk single file. I don't like this, Mark said, stopping at the entrance. Feels like a trap. Everything here is a trap, Alan replied, but we need to keep moving. He entered first, rifle held at the ready. Mark followed, and I brought up the rear. The passage curved slightly, enough that I couldn't see the end from the entrance. The walls seemed closer than they had been a moment ago, the ceiling lower. I was about 10 paces in when I heard a grinding sound behind me. I turned to see the walls shifting, closing in like a vice. I lunged forward, trying to catch up to Mark, but the gap sealed before I could reach him. "Mark!" I shouted, pounding on the solid concrete that had appeared between us. "Alan!" I heard muffled voices on the other side, but couldn't make out what they were saying. The walls continued to move, herding me forward down a new path that opened to my right. I had no choice but to follow it. The passage wound through the city like a vein, narrowing and widening unpredictably. The whispers that had been present in the static of our radios were louder now, no longer needing technology to reach me. They spoke in half-familiar voices, saying words I almost understood. I don't know how long I walked alone. My watch still ticked, but the hands moved at different speeds, sometimes clockwise, sometimes counter. The wrongness of the sunlight never changed. It remained fixed in the northern sky, casting those upward shadows that made the world feel inverted. The passage finally opened into a small courtyard surrounded by featureless buildings. And there, standing in the center, were Sarah and Lily. My wife wore the blue dress she'd had on the day of the accident. My daughter was in her school uniform. They were exactly as I remembered them, perfect in every detail, except they were burning. Flames licked at their skin, peeling it away in sheets that curled and blackened. Yet they smiled, the muscles of their faces exposed as the fire consumed them. "Dan," Sarah said, her voice exactly as I remembered. "Why weren't you there? You promised you'd always protect us." "Daddy," Lily said, reaching out with a hand that was mostly bone. "It hurts so much. Why didn't you save us?" I knew it wasn't real. Some rational part of my brain screamed that this was the city, using my grief against me just as it had used the voices of the dead against all of us. Sarah and Lily had died instantly. There had been no fire, no suffering, but I walked toward them anyway. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there." Their skin continued to burn, sloughing off to reveal muscle and bone beneath. The smell hit me, not the acrid scent of smoke, but the sweet, sickening odor of cooking meat. Their screams began, rising in perfect harmony, exactly matching the sounds I'd imagined in my darkest moments when the police report wasn't enough to convince me they hadn't suffered. "You let us burn," Sarah wailed, her face half gone now, one eye melting down her cheek. "You let us die alone." "It hurts, Daddy," Lily sobbed, her small body racked with tremors as the flames consumed her. "Make it stop. Please make it stop." I reached for them, no longer caring if they were real or not. My fingers passed through Sarah's outstretched hand, like smoke. They weren't solid, just projections, hallucinations given form by whatever power controlled this place. "You're not real," I said, even as tears blurred my vision. "You can't be real." "We're as real as your guilt," Sarah said, her voice distorting as her mouth burned away. "As real as your failure." I fell to my knees, covering my ears as their screams intensified. But it didn't help. The sound was inside my head, bypassing my ears entirely. I could still see them burning, still smell their flesh cooking, still hear their accusations. "I'm sorry," I repeated, rocking back and forth. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." The concrete beneath me felt solid, real. I pressed my hands against it, trying to ground myself in something physical. My nails scraped against the rough surface as I clawed at it, needing to feel pain, something to cut through the hallucination. I don't know when I started screaming. I don't know when my fingernails tore off, leaving bloody tracks on the concrete. I only remember the burning figures of my wife and daughter, circling me, their voices rising and falling in waves of accusation and pain. "Dan! Dan!" A new voice cut through the screaming. Hands gripped my shoulders, shaking me. "Jesus Christ, Dan! Snap out of it!" Mark's face swam into focus, replacing the burning vision of my family. His expression was one of horror and concern. Beyond him, Alan stood with his rifle raised, scanning the empty courtyard. "They were here," I gasped, my throat raw from screaming. "Sarah and Lily, they were burning. They were right here." "There's nothing here," Mark said, helping me to my feet. "We've been looking for you for hours." "Hours?" I looked down at my hands, bloody and mangled where I'd torn my fingernails off against the concrete. It felt like minutes. "Time doesn't work right here," Alan said, still scanning the surroundings. "For us, you've been missing nearly 5 hours. The walls closed between you and Mark, and by the time we found another way around, you were gone." "How did you find me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark and Alan exchanged a glance. "We followed your screams," Mark said simply. "You've been screaming for forgiveness for at least 20 minutes. I looked around the courtyard. There was no sign of Sarah or Lily, no lingering smell of burning flesh, just concrete and empty buildings under a sun that hung in the wrong part of the sky. "We need to keep moving," Alan said, his voice gentler than I'd heard it before. "Can you walk?" I nodded, though my legs felt weak and disconnected from my body. Mark supported me with a hand under my arm as we left the courtyard, following Alan through the ever-changing maze of the city. We fled through the disintegrating city, Mark's arm hooked around my waist as he helped me move. My bloody fingers left smears on his jacket, the pain sharp and real after I'd clawed them raw against the concrete. Behind us, a terrible grinding noise filled the air, the sound of reality folding in on itself. "The whole place is coming apart," Alan called back, his voice barely audible above the cacophony. "We need to move faster." I pushed my legs harder, trying to take more of my own weight. Mark winced as I shifted against him. I noticed for the first time that blood soaked his right pant leg. "What happened to you?" I asked, my voice still rough from screaming. "Cut myself on rebar trying to get to you," he answered through gritted teeth. "It's not deep." Alan stopped at an intersection, holding up his hand. To our left, a massive concrete wall folded inward, compressing into a shape that hurt my eyes to follow. It wasn't crumbling or breaking. The solid concrete bent like paper, creasing along invisible lines. Buildings that had stood 6 stories tall moments before now flattened, creating new geometries impossible in our world. "This way," Alan said, pointing to what looked like a maintenance door set into the wall of a low-slung utility building. "Service tunnels might be our best chance." We stumbled through the door into darkness. Alan clicked on his flashlight, revealing a long corridor that sloped gently downward. Pipes ran along the ceiling, hissing with steam or something that looked like steam but smelled like copper. "Keep moving," Alan urged, taking the lead. "Don't touch the pipes." The tunnel stretched far longer than the building above it could possibly contain. We passed junction after junction, Alan selecting turns with a confidence I didn't understand. The air grew warmer, more humid as we descended. "You know these tunnels?" Mark asked between labored breaths. Alan didn't turn around. "I spent 3 days down here last time. Some paths lead out, some lead deeper in, some lead nowhere at all." "How do you know which is which?" I asked. "I don't," Alan admitted. "But they feel different. The wrong ones. They pull at you." As if on cue, I felt a subtle tug from a side passage we passed, a gentle urge to turn, to walk down the darkened corridor. Alan noticed my hesitation and grabbed my arm, yanking me forward. "Don't listen to it," he said. "That's how we lost Reyes last time. He said he heard his son calling from one of the tunnels." We continued in silence after that, the only sounds our footsteps and ragged breathing. The tunnels wound beneath the city like veins, connecting buildings that should have been blocks apart. Occasionally, we climbed metal ladders to upper levels or descended deeper when our path was blocked by collapsed sections. The rumbling above grew louder, punctuated by crashes as the city continued its impossible folding. Dust sifted down from the ceiling with each impact. After what seemed like hours, but might have been minutes, Alan stopped at a junction where 5 tunnels met in a circular chamber. He trained his flashlight on each opening in turn, his expression grim. "What's wrong?" Mark asked, leaning against the wall for support. "This junction wasn't here before," Alan said. "None of these tunnels feel right." A deep vibration passed through the floor, strong enough to make us stagger. Fine cracks appeared in the concrete walls, spreading like spider webs. "We can't stay here," I said, watching as the cracks widened. Alan hesitated, then pointed to the second tunnel from the right. "That one. It feels less wrong than the others." We hurried into the tunnel just as a section of ceiling collapsed behind us, sealing our path. The new tunnel was wider than the others, with a higher ceiling. The walls were lined with metal panels that reflected our flashlight beams in distorted patterns. "Keep your eyes on the floor," Alan warned. "Don't look too long at the reflections." I caught a glimpse of movement in one panel, a twisted version of myself with too many eyes, mouth stretched in a silent scream. I quickly looked away, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. The tunnel ended abruptly at a metal door. Alan pushed it open, revealing a narrow alley between 2 buildings that hadn't yet succumbed to the city's collapse. Night air hit my face, cool compared to the humid warmth of the tunnels. "We need to cross this plaza," Alan said, pointing to an open space beyond the alley. "After that, we're maybe half a mile from the edge." "No choice but to run for it?" Mark asked, checking his pistol. Alan nodded. "Move as fast as you can. Don't stop. Don't look back." We emerged from the alley into the plaza, a vast open space surrounded by buildings that twisted upward at impossible angles. Some had folded in on themselves, creating massive overhangs that defied gravity. Others had merged together, concrete flowing like liquid where walls met. We were halfway across when I heard it, a sound like 1,000 whispers speaking in unison, rising from behind us. Despite Alan's warning, I turned to look. It filled the far side of the plaza, a mass of twisted flesh the size of a building. Countless human limbs fused together to form its bulk, arms and legs jutting at odd angles, hands grasping at the air. Its surface was covered in eyes, human eyes, blinking in unison, all fixed on us. It moved on appendages made from fused bodies, pulling itself forward with sickening fluidity. "Run!" Alan shouted, firing his rifle at the monstrosity. The bullets struck home, tearing into flesh, but the thing showed no sign of pain or slowing. Instead, it opened what might have been a mouth, a massive cavity lined with human faces, all screaming silently. From that nightmare, Maw came a chorus of voices, each one distinct yet speaking together. "Daniel, Mark, Alan," they called, the sound washing over us like a physical wave. I recognized some of the voices. Sarah was there, and Lily, along with others I couldn't name but somehow knew. Mark stumbled beside me, his injured leg giving out. I caught him before he fell, dragging him forward as Alan provided covering fire. The thing moved faster now, closing the distance with unnatural speed. We reached the far side of the plaza, ducking into a narrow street lined with low buildings. Alan led us through a maze of alleys and side streets, the sound of the pursuing entity always just behind us. Occasionally, we passed through buildings with doors that opened where walls should have been, or stairwells that crossed between structures without regard for physical space. The darkness began to lift, the black sky lightening to deep blue, then pale lavender. For the first time since we'd entered the city, I saw the sun rising where it belonged, in the east, casting normal shadows that stretched westward. The impossible geometry of the city seemed less pronounced in the growing light, as if the sun's normalcy imposed some order on the chaos. We emerged from an alleyway onto what had been the outskirts when we'd entered. The road where we'd left our trucks stretched before us, but the vehicles were nowhere to be seen. In their place, massive sand dunes rose 15 or 20 feet high, golden in the morning light. "The trucks!" Mark gasped, leaning heavily on my shoulder. "They're gone." Alan stopped at the edge of the pavement where it met the desert. "The desert's reclaiming the approaches," he said, gesturing toward the horizon. A massive wall of sand rose in the distance, rolling toward us with unnatural speed. The sandstorm stretched from ground to sky, a brown curtain advancing across the desert. "That wasn't on the forecast," Mark said weakly. "It happens sometimes," Alan replied, his voice flat. "The desert tries to bury this place, like an immune response." I looked back toward the city. Buildings continued to fold and compress, entire blocks vanishing as structures flattened against each other. Through gaps between collapsing buildings, I caught glimpses of the thing pursuing us, still coming, still calling our names with the voices of the dead. "We have no choice," Alan said, staring at the approaching storm. "We need to go through it." "Through a sandstorm?" Mark asked. "We won't last an hour." "We won't last 5 minutes if we stay here," Alan countered, pointing back toward the city. "The storm might hide us. It's our only chance." I helped Mark down the dune, the sand shifting beneath our feet. Every step was a struggle, but the growing light and normal sun gave me strength I hadn't felt since entering the city. Behind us, the chorus of voices grew louder. The storm hit us just as we reached level ground. The sound came first, a roaring howl that drowned out the voices. Then the sand, a wall of stinging particles that cut visibility to nothing. I pulled my shirt up over my nose and mouth, squinting against the onslaught. "Stay together," Alan shouted, barely audible through the storm. "Follow me." I kept my hand on Mark's back as we trudged forward, the sand tearing at any exposed skin. The pain from my torn fingernails intensified as sand worked its way into the raw flesh, but it kept me grounded in reality. After the hallucinations, the pain felt almost welcome, something definitively real. We walked for what felt like hours, but might have been minutes. Time had lost all meaning in the city, and the uniform brown darkness of the storm offered no reference points. Mark grew heavier against me, his steps becoming more labored. "I need to rest," he gasped, his voice muffled by the cloth covering his face. "We can't stop," I said, pulling him forward. "Keep moving." A particularly strong gust hit us from the side, almost knocking us over. When I regained my balance, I realized I could no longer see Alan ahead of us. "Alan!" I called, the wind tearing the sound away. No response came except the howling of the storm. "Alan!" I tried again, louder this time. "This way!" came a voice through the swirling sand. "I'm over here!" I moved toward the sound, supporting Mark as best I could. The voice called again, guiding us forward, but something felt wrong. The timbre of it shifted subtly with each call, becoming softer, more familiar. "Dan," it called, no longer Alan's gruff tone, but something sweeter, more intimate. "Dan, come home," Sarah's voice, perfect and clear despite the storm. "That's not Alan," Mark said, his grip tightening on my shoulder. "Don't follow it." I hesitated, torn between the voice I'd longed to hear for 2 years and the knowledge that it couldn't be real. The storm swirled around us, momentarily clearing enough to show a figure standing 20 yards ahead. For an instant, I saw Sarah's silhouette, hand outstretched toward me. "Dan, please," she called. "I'm waiting for you." I took a step forward before Mark pulled me back. "It's not real," he said, his voice firm despite his weakness. "Remember what happened in the courtyard. The city's still trying to take you." The figure wavered in the blowing sand, Sarah's form elongating. stretching into something that no longer resembled a human. I turned away, pulling Mark in a different direction. "Daniel, over here!" Alan's voice, different from Sarah's, came from our right, then again from our left, then from behind us. The storm seemed filled with voices calling my name, each one trying to pull us in a different direction. I stopped moving, paralyzed by indecision. Mark sagged against me, his breathing labored. "We can't trust any of them," he said. Which way were we going before we lost him? I tried to remember, but in the brown darkness of the storm, all directions looked the same. The sun that had briefly oriented us was now hidden behind the wall of sand. "I think that way," I said, pointing into the wind. Walking into the storm would be harder, but it felt right somehow. We pushed forward, ignoring the voices that continued to call from all around us. The sand stripped away layers of skin, but I welcomed the pain. It kept me anchored, prevented me from drifting toward those beckoning voices. Mark grew heavier with each step until I was practically dragging him. His face was pale beneath the mask of dirt and blood, his eyes unfocused. "Leave me," he mumbled. "Save yourself." "No," I said firmly. "We stay together." I came back to consciousness slowly, awareness returning in fragments. First, the antiseptic smell. Then, the mechanical beeping. Finally, the dull ache that seemed to permeate every cell in my body. My eyelids felt heavy, like they'd been glued shut, but I managed to force them open. White ceiling tiles, fluorescent lights, an IV stand beside me with clear fluid dripping into tubes that disappeared beneath white bandages on my arms. I was in a hospital room, though something about it felt wrong. No windows, no television mounted on the wall, no call button within reach. Just 2 beds, medical equipment, and a door with a small reinforced glass panel. Mark lay in the bed next to mine, his face pale against the white sheets. His chest rose and fell in a shallow rhythm, but his eyes remained closed. Bandages covered his right leg where he'd cut it on the rebar, and more wrapped around his hands where the sand had stripped away layers of skin. Between our beds sat Alan. He was hunched forward in a metal chair, elbows on his knees, staring at a spot on the floor. He looked physically intact, no bandages, no visible wounds, but his eyes had changed. They moved constantly, tracking things I couldn't see, pupils dilated despite the bright lights. Every few minutes, a small whimper escaped his lips, like a frightened child trying to stay quiet. "Alan," I called, my voice a dry rasp. He didn't look up or show any sign he'd heard me. I tried to sit up, but my body refused to cooperate fully. The best I could manage was to prop myself up on one elbow. My hands were heavily bandaged where I'd torn my fingernails off against the concrete in the city. "Alan," I tried again. "Where are we?" This time his eyes flicked toward me, then away just as quickly. His lips moved, forming words without sound. I leaned closer, straining to hear. "They're all around us," he whispered, so quietly I nearly missed it. "They followed us out. They're waiting, watching. All those eyes." A chill ran through me despite the warmth of the room. Before I could respond, the door opened. 2 men in military uniforms entered first, taking positions on either side of the door. They carried sidearms, but no rifles, their expressions neutral as they scanned the room. After them came an older man with silver hair and colonel's eagles on his uniform. His posture was perfect, shoulders square, head held high with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, approaching my bed. "Good to see you're awake. I'm Colonel Harrison." I looked from him to the guards and back. "Where are we?" "Ate. A secure medical facility outside Las Vegas," Harrison replied. "You've been unconscious for 36 hours. Our team found you approximately 2 miles from the anomaly's perimeter, half buried in sand. You're lucky the storm let up when it did." The anomaly. Such a clean, clinical word for that nightmare city. "How did you find us?" I asked. "We never lost you," Harrison said. "Every team we send in is tracked. When your vital signs indicated extreme distress, we dispatched a recovery unit. Every team they send in." The words echoed in my head, confirming what Alan had told us in the city. This hadn't been an accident or a one-time mission. They'd done this before. "How many?" I asked. Harrison smiled thinly. "You're direct. I appreciate that." He pulled the other chair closer to my bed and sat down. You were the 15th team we've sent into the anomaly since we established the current protocols in 1992. I looked at Mark, still unconscious, then at Alan, who had resumed staring at the floor. And how many made it out? Physically, about 60%, Harrison said. Mentally intact? That's much rarer. You appear to be only the third individual to emerge with your cognitive functions relatively unimpaired. Alan whimpered again, rocking slightly in his chair. What about him? I nodded toward Alan. He was one of your successes, right? That's why you sent him back in. Harrison's expression didn't change, but something hardened in his eyes. Mr. Walsh's first exposure showed promising resilience. We hoped a second controlled exposure would help us understand the protective factors. Controlled? I almost laughed. Nothing about that place is controlled. The anomaly itself, no, Harrison agreed. But our observation methods have improved considerably. We now have a much clearer understanding of how long human consciousness can withstand exposure before permanent damage occurs. I looked at Alan again. Permanent damage. The word seemed inadequate for what had happened to him. What is that place? I asked. Harrison leaned back, considering me for a moment before answering. In 1978, the military conducted an experiment in quantum field manipulation. They were attempting to create a localized distortion in space-time, essentially a controlled wormhole. Something went wrong. Instead of a temporary distortion, they created what we now understand to be a permanent wound in the fabric of reality. A wound, I repeated. The description fit better than anything else I could imagine. A festering, infected gash in the world. The city was built around the original test site, Harrison continued. A controlled environment where we could study the effects and, hopefully, learn to close the breach. But the anomaly grew. It consumed the city, twisted it. Within 3 years, we had to abandon the site entirely. And now you send people in to see what happens to them, I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. Harrison didn't deny it. We need to understand how human consciousness interacts with altered physical laws. Some minds break immediately, others last longer. A very few, like yours, seem to possess a natural resistance. There was nothing natural about what happened to us, I said. That city, it knew us. It used our memories, our grief. Yes, Harrison nodded. That's what makes it so valuable for research. The anomaly doesn't just distort physical space, it responds to consciousness itself. It's as if reality becomes malleable when exposed to human thought patterns. The implications are enormous. Implications? I almost choked on the word. Jin is dead. Alan's mind is gone. Mark is... I looked at my friend's still form. Mr. Peterson will recover, physically at least, Harrison said, following my gaze. The psychological evaluation will determine whether he can return to normal life. I remembered the voices in the sandstorm, calling us from all directions. The way the city had shown me Sarah and Lily burning. How much worse had it been for Alan, who'd been exposed twice? Why are you telling me all this? I asked. Harrison straightened in his chair. Because you've earned certain considerations. Your participation, willing or not, has provided valuable data. In return, the government is prepared to offer compensation. Compensation, I repeated dully. A significant sum. New identity if you want it. Relocation assistance, medical care for any lingering effects. All we require is your confidentiality. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thin folder, placing it on my lap. The standard agreement. Take your time, read it carefully. I didn't touch the folder. And if I don't sign? Harrison's smile never reached his eyes. Mr. Mitchell, you were recruited for an assessment of an abandoned military facility. That's the official record. Any claims about reality-bending cities or psychological experimentation would be dismissed as trauma-induced delusions. We'd have no choice but to place you under psychiatric observation until your condition stabilized. The threat was clear. Sign or be locked away like Alan. I'll think about it, I said. Harrison stood. Of course. We'll talk again tomorrow. He nodded to the guards, who opened the door for him. At the threshold, he paused. For what it's worth, Mr. Mitchell, your resilience is remarkable. Most people exposed to the anomaly never recover. You might? After they left, I lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling. Alan continued his silent vigil, occasionally tracking invisible movements across the room with his eyes. Mark remained unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. I must have dozed off because when I opened my eyes again, the lights had been dimmed for night. The clock on the wall read 2:17 a.m. Something had woken me, a sound or movement. Mark was sitting up in his bed, staring at me with wide eyes. "They're going to kill me," he whispered. I pushed myself upright, wincing at the pain in my hands. "Mark, you're awake? How do you feel?" He shook his head frantically. "Listen to me. I heard them talking when they thought I was still out. This place, what they did, it's worse than Alan said. They're not studying it. They're trying to weaponize it." Weaponize? The idea seemed absurd. How could anyone control that? "They can't. That's the point," Mark said, his voice urgent. "But they think they can use it. Create temporary breaches near enemy positions. Let the effects drive people insane, then close it." He glanced at the door. "I'm going public. As soon as they discharge me, I'm taking everything to the press." I looked at Alan, who had finally fallen asleep in his chair, his face twitching with dreams I couldn't imagine. "They'll never let you," I said. "They'll say you're having delusions from trauma." "I have proof," Mark insisted. "I kept a log on my phone. Video, audio. I kept it running the whole time." He patted his arm, then looked around frantically. "My stuff? Where's my gear?" "Probably locked up somewhere," I said. "Mark, this is crazy. These people are criminals," he finished for me. "What they did to us, to Jin, to Alan, to how many others, they have to be stopped." He swung his legs over the side of the bed. "Help me find my things." "You can't even walk," I protested. "Then I'll crawl," he said, determination hardening his features. "I'm not letting them get away with this. Are you with me or not?" I looked at him, really looked at him. Mark had always been the one with convictions, with a moral center. Even recruiting me for this mission had been his way of trying to help me, though it had gone horribly wrong. And he was right about what had happened to us. It was criminal. But in that moment, I realized something about myself. The city hadn't hollowed me out. I'd done that myself, long before we ever went to Nevada. After Sarah and Lily died, I'd stopped caring about anything, including justice or truth. "I can't," I said finally. "I just want to forget all this, take the money and disappear." Disappointment crossed Mark's face, but he nodded. "I understand. After what you've been through, losing your family, then this. Just promise me you'll get somewhere safe. Don't let them keep tabs on you." "What about you?" I asked. "I'll wait until they discharge me," Mark said. "Play along, sign whatever they want. Then I'll go public." He reached over and gripped my arm. "Be careful, Dan." I nodded, a sense of foreboding settling over me. The next morning, a doctor I hadn't seen before came to check on us. He examined Mark first, changing the bandages on his leg and hands, checking his vital signs. "Looking good, Mr. Peterson," the doctor said. "Another day or two of observation, and we can discuss discharge planning." Mark nodded, playing the cooperative patient perfectly. Only I could see the determination behind his eyes. After examining me and changing my bandages, the doctor turned to Alan. "Mr. Walsh," he said loudly, as if Alan were deaf rather than traumatized. "Can you hear me?" Alan's eyes focused briefly on the doctor, then slid away. "I'm going to check your vital signs now," the doctor continued, reaching for Alan's wrist. Alan suddenly scrambled backward in his chair, pressing himself against the wall. "No!" he screamed, the first clear word I'd heard from him since waking up. "Not again! I won't go back!" Two nurses rushed in, restraining Alan as he thrashed and fought. The doctor prepared a syringe and injected something into Alan's arm. Within seconds, his struggles weakened, then stopped entirely. The nurses lifted his now limp body onto a gurney. "Where are you taking him?" I asked. "Mr. Walsh needs specialized care," the doctor replied, not meeting my eyes. "He's being transferred to a facility better equipped for his condition." They wheeled Alan out, his eyes still open but unfocused, arms secured with padded restraints. I never saw him again. Colonel Harrison returned that afternoon. He sat in the chair Alan had occupied, his posture as perfect as before. "Have you had a chance to review the agreement?" he asked. Yes," I said, though I hadn't opened the folder. "I'll sign it." He raised an eyebrow. "Just like that? No questions, no negotiations?" "I want to forget this ever happened," I said. "The money, the new identity, it doesn't matter. I just want out." Harrison studied me for a moment, then nodded. I understand. We'll prepare the final documents for your signature tomorrow. That night, I was awakened by alarms. Medical staff rushed into the room surrounding Mark's bed. His body convulsed, back arching off the mattress as a doctor called for medication. They worked frantically, inserting tubes, attaching monitors, calling out numbers and medical terms I didn't understand. None of them paid any attention to me as I watched from my bed, frozen in horror. After 20 minutes of desperate activity, a doctor shook his head and called out a time of death. Just like that, Mark was gone. A nurse finally noticed me staring. She pulled a curtain between the beds, blocking my view of Mark's body, now covered with a sheet. "I'm sorry," she said. "Your friend developed complications from exposure. Sometimes internal injuries aren't immediately apparent." She gave me a sedative despite my protests. As consciousness faded, I wondered if Mark had really had hidden injuries, or if Harrison had decided he was too great a risk. I signed the papers the next morning. Harrison didn't mention Mark's death, and neither did I. The terms were generous: $2 million in an offshore account, a new identity complete with background and documentation, relocation assistance to anywhere in the continental United States, and ongoing medical care through designated private facilities. In exchange, I agreed never to discuss the city, the experiment, or anything I had witnessed. Violation would result in immediate cessation of benefits and, reading between the lines, much worse. 3 days later, I was discharged with a clean bill of health, at least physically. A car took me to a private airfield where a jet waited to fly me to my chosen destination, Portland, Oregon, a place where I knew no one and no one knew me. I had a new driver's license identifying me as David Morris, a new passport, new credit cards linked to accounts already filled with money, a furnished apartment waiting for me, everything I needed to start over. 6 months passed. I settled into a quiet routine in Portland. My apartment overlooked the Willamette River, the constant movement of water somehow soothing. I didn't work, didn't need to. I rarely left home except for necessities, avoiding crowds and conversation. The city had changed me, though not in ways that showed on medical scans. I still heard the whispers sometimes, especially at night, voices that almost formed words before dissolving into meaningless sounds. I still saw twisted faces in crowds, normal people whose features would suddenly slide and reform like melting wax before snapping back to normal. I knew they weren't real. The doctors had assured me the hallucinations would fade with time, but knowing something isn't real doesn't make it less terrifying. At night, Sarah and Lily still visited me, not burning as they had in the city, but whole and beautiful as they had been in life. They sat at the foot of my bed, watching me with sad eyes, never speaking. I would reach for them, knowing my hands would pass through them like smoke, but reaching anyway. I survived the city. I took the money. I disappeared. But the truth was, the city claimed me anyway. Not my life or my sanity, but something deeper, my capacity to feel anything beyond a dull, persistent dread. The world outside my window continued turning. People lived and loved and fought and made up. They had bad days and good ones. They built lives filled with meaning and connection. I just existed, a hollow shell of a man who had walked through a wound in reality and emerged carrying a piece of that wrongness inside him. Not quite alive, not quite dead. Just here, waiting for whatever came next.